Legitimacy. Precedence. Sabiqun as-sabiqun. Right? There is a precedence for people who accepted Islam earlier. So if you look at all of those values that Islam has given, in terms of precedence, in terms of knowledge, in terms of piety, and you look where in Islamic history were they applied. Look at the Sunni history of Saqifa. Was precedence in taqwa applied? Is that what the Ansar said? Is that what Abu Bakr himself said? Is that what Umar himself said? Right? When the second caliph was chosen, history in Sunni sources narrates how Abu Bakr made that choice. Right? Was it the most knowledgeable? Was it on the basis of those values the Quran says are more important for a Muslim community? Was Uthman chosen for those reasons? Right? You don't need to look for a Shia history, just any standard history of Islam. The reasons why those choices were made are mentioned. And then you look at the Shia perspective. What did the Shia believe about Imamah? One part of that belief in Imamah, which is not found in the Quranic values about religious guidance and leadership, which are about knowledge, which are about precedence in faith, which are about piety. One other example we have, and this is the last part I'll make of this question, is the Quran. Does the Quran talk about Mahdawiyyat or not? No. Every religion believes that there is going to be a savior. Right? The Quran and all Muslims, Sunni and Shia, agree that even Adam taught that this religion is eventually going to triumph. Truth is going to triumph. Nuh alayhi salam taught it. Ibrahim alayhi salam taught it. Musa alayhi salam taught it. Isa alayhi salam taught it. The prophets in the middle, according to the Quran, Prophet Dawood taught it. He's not even an Ulul Azm prophet who brought a new Sharia, but it was part of his teachings. Right? Sunni and Shia believe that all of them were teaching something that's going to happen far in the future. It's in our ummah that the promise is going to take place. So the Quran says, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ. That this is written in Zabur. Why does the Quran not mention it more? If it was so important that even the Prophet thousands of years ago taught Mahdawiyyah, why does the Quran not teach it explicitly? So if somebody says, why is Imamat not mentioned like this? I wanted to see at least 10 verses say, who are the Imams, then I would believe it. Right? All right? Let's leave aside Imamat because it's controversial. Mahdawiyyat is not controversial. And we find in some instances perhaps less focus on Mahdawiyyat in the Quran than in Hadith, Sunni Hadith or Shia Hadith, and less focus than we find even in previous scriptures, when it was less relevant for them and more relevant for us, because we're going to have to actually make the decision, is this person claiming to be the Mahdi true or false? The Ummah of Isa didn't have to make that decision. The Ummah of Ibrahim didn't have to make that decision. We do. Yet the Quran, does it mention Mahdawiyyat explicitly? So is it unimportant or is it important? It's important. No Muslim can stay Muslim and say it's not important. Then why does the Quran mention it in the same way? Because that is the nature of a murabbi. He knows that if he mentioned Mahdawiyyat perhaps in a different way, it would be abused by people. I would claim to be a Mahdi and I would get 30 followers and I'd go, God forbid, maybe start a cult. And many people in Islamic history do. So Allah controls His message and says that if you want to understand the importance or unimportance of something, get the values from the Quran, apply them according to the teachings, and the practice of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. Right? If you're not Shia, then at least the practices of the Prophet, which will lead you to Ahlul Bayt. And that comes in a lot of things in theology. Right? So the question, short answer is, people always ask the Shia, why does the Quran not mention Imamat more explicitly? Right? The Quran doesn't mention a lot of theological topics that require tarbiyah and tazkiyah explicitly, because there's a process by which a person has to acquire and understand it. If you don't go through that process, then just get the answer and you're not going to be able to achieve guidance. It might cause more problems than good. Bring animosity and so many other problems. Any questions on the Quranic approach to Imamah and also Mahdawiyyah?
Actually, that raises a question. There are clear minority of Shia to say there is a question about Quran, that this Quran maybe was changed, that this is not the Quran.
There's two ways to respond to that. Number one is that historically now we have a large number of Qurans that are from within 100 years of the Prophet's life. From Yemen, from Iraq, from Hijaz itself. So we actually have historical evidence that the Quran that we have today is very similar to the Quran that was in the time of the Prophet. Historically, we can't say it's exactly the same because we don't have all of the Arab, we don't have every 600 pages of the Quran. But historically, based on the evidence we have, if there is a difference, if there's uncertainty, it's only about 1%, 2%, maybe 5% of the Quran. The rest of it is historically almost impossible to argue did not exist. That's number one argument. Through historical evidence, which can bring us 90% of the way. The other argument is from collective memory. Collective memory argument is that you had Sunni, you had Shia, you had Khariji, you had so many schools of thought, they differed very early in Islam. But no one has a different Quran or an alternative Quran. Right? You have ahadith that say that there was a different Quran. Right? But those ahadith are easy to forge. I consider my closet and forge a hadith right now. But we don't have any collective narration or memory from any Muslim group that, well, here is the alternative Quran. Right? That by itself, although Muslims were not ever united in anything else, is strong evidence that the Quran was not changed. And then we have a theological argument, which is mentioned by ulama, that God has promised to preserve the Quranic text and message. So those are several ways to say that the Quran, if a Shia or a Sunni were to say that I want proof that it hasn't been changed, right? Then we can at least say that what level of change do you think there is? Is it like the Bible, where we don't know if the book is authentic? Or is it that we know that 95% is authentic, we just don't know about that 5%? If it's 5%, then the overall argument doesn't make a difference. The Quran does not mention the issues of what leadership is like. Right? And that's why, if you see the Quran talk about ulul amr, the people who have authority, right? It's not any clearer for the Sunnis where they have any evidence that this refers to political authorities. For Shia to say that, well, why doesn't it say specifically that ulul amr must be ma'soom? So, as a whole, the authenticity of the Quran is something that even non-Muslim scholars now generally accept. There was a time when there were a lot of doubts that were raised, but since there's much better scholarship and much better historical evidence, generally it's not very controversial. If there is a controversy, it's just about that 5%. And if the Quran is substantially the Quran that we had in the time of the Prophet, even historically, as Muslims theologically we believe it's the exact same Quran. But even historically, if it's the similar Quran, then the question is not, why is imamat not mentioned? The question is, why is any kind of leadership not mentioned explicitly in the Quran? Sahaba are not mentioned explicitly in the Quran. And the answer then we have to get is that there must be a wisdom, that Allah wanted us to get that answer through a process of getting the values from the Quran and trying to apply them to the history and the seerah of the Prophet, so that we stay within the family of an ummah, but we can have a process of growth and development rather than just to get the result or the answer.
Does this support the argument for leadership?
Yeah, the verse, Surah Baqarah, verse 124, mentions imamat explicitly, and it mentions that imamat is a divine covenant or an ahd. That almost universally by Shi'i scholars has been said to refer to imamat as a position of leadership which is broader than prophethood and therefore includes our imams, but it also includes some prophets. So Ibrahim alayhi salam was an imam in this sense, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi was an imam in this sense. And anybody else who had that job of leadership, like our imams, is also an imam. Shias have been unanimous in saying this does prove imamah, right? And I think that argument is a very sound argument. But I don't think that verse is enough. Right? The point is that the Prophet brought this religion. All Muslims agree it's a complete religion. All Muslims agree it's supposed to triumph in the world eventually. The question is, how do we get from this Quran, this book of fiqh and sharia, right, to perfection? Right? Can Syed Sistani do it? Can Syed Khamenei do it? Can any non-ma'asum do it? Any alim, any professor, any community activist? Right? If Islam is to triumph, no non-ma'asum, even a marji' taqlid, cannot do it. It's just not our human ability. So then, does the Quran give us an explicit logic? That this is my promise, this is my claim. How are you going to get to that? Right? We don't have an explicit logic, so we have to look for it. And if you start from here, right, then you look at the verse of Surah Baqarah, verse 124. You look at the verses that speak about the criteria for Islamic leadership, the criteria for guidance. And in my mind, if you look at all of the possible opinions in the Muslim world, other than the Shi'i opinion, nothing makes sense. Now, I'm not saying you have to be a 12 Imam Shia. That comes later. But what I mean right now is Shia in the general sense. First of all, Imam Ali. Because at the time of Imam Ali, nobody else could make a reasonable claim to have the piety or the knowledge of Imam Ali. I might be Ismaili, I might be Zaydi, I might be Ithna Ash'ari. That comes later to decide which of those paths is right. But outside of that family of Shi'ism, or outside of that family of Ahlul Bayt, or outside of that family of people who believe that Imam Ali was the successor, I don't see any way to say that this was based on Quranic logic. I don't see anybody making a reasonable claim that Abu Bakr was chosen on Quranic logic. Not that he was a bad person. Somebody believes he was an effective ruler, he was a tribal uniter. That's, politics, that's a separate historical question. But nobody can argue legitimately that in Saqifa there was an Islamic, Quranic choice made. And that's not only the verse of Surah Baqarah, but it's by looking at the entirety of the Quran. What are the principles and the values that the Quran says are going to be the cause for success of Muslims? So that is the approach I think that we should take to that. This will be the last question then for this issue.
In the same sense, in regard to the Abidi, we have the verses that don't attract to that condition.
But those verses also are not.
They say that this is related to this. When Prophet raised
the verse of Ghadir. The verse of Tabligh and the verse of Ikmal al-Din. In the Sunni world, there is a strong opinion, strong in the sense of common, not strong scholastically, but common opinion, that those verses pertain to the Hajj. And it was the Hajj, which is the only Hajj the Prophet did as after Hijrah, and the day of Arafah, that was the perfection of the religion. Although the Sunnis do also have a hadith that say it was the day of Ghadir. It's widely reported. But many of them lean towards the opinion that it must have been the day of Arafah because they don't want to, or whatever reason, they don't emphasize the day of Ghadir. So those verses are valid, but they're not explicit. Right? You need hadith. And then the Sunni tradition has a hadith that it was Ghadir and a hadith that it was Arafah. So if you're not already sympathetic, or if you're not a scholar, right, take your average Sunni neighbor who's going to open up a book of tafsir, it can be confusing. So again, the verse of Ghadir, the verses of speaking of imamat being a divine covenant and ahd, a hadith of the Prophet that speak of Ahlul Bayt, all of them are valid paths. They're valid, they're right, they're legitimate arguments. But the question, if the question is why is the Quran not more explicit and why is imamat not mentioned more frequently, then I think the real question needs to be answered with a question. It needs to be answered with a further question that, all right, where in the Quran has religious leadership or the manner of Mahdawiyyat or the manner of the fulfillment of God's promise been explained in detail? The question is not just for the Shia, it's a question for the Ummah as a whole. Nobody has an explicit, clear answer that, all right, first the Caliph is Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, then so-and-so. Then you're supposed to choose your Caliph by shura or by heredity. That's not in the Quran. Explicit naming of our 12 Imams is not in the Quran. Right? So the question is not why is imamat not in the Quran. The question is why would the Quran choose to use a certain approach to convey something? And if we can understand that, then we would say, all right, use the Quranic logic to choose who is to be the leader. Right? Does piety come after stability, or does stability come from piety? And the Quran is clear in that. When the Quran gives permission for the Battle of Badr and other battles, that logic is very clear. Outside of the Shia family, and by Shia family I mean, in general, the path of Ahlul Bayt, I don't think there's any real claim to be made that the Quranic logic was applied. The system of Khilafah doesn't have that. The system of leadership that exists within the mainstream Sunni world is lacking that Quranic element. So let's move on. The other question related now to this question was, by the way, I'm not claiming that answer is fully complete. That's, I think, a good starting point for you to, now, next time you read the Quran, try to pull out those values that you think the Quran is emphasizing for how you should develop a loyalty. And then read any history you want of the different claims made for right after the Prophet. What should the Muslims do? And see which one fits with that Quranic logic in the best way. That's a path that's accessible to every Muslim. Any Muslim who can read a translation of the Quran or a book of history has access to that path. My claim is that a person who does that will see clearly that Shia claim of imamat is Quranic and logical. And any alternative claim is maybe politically sophisticated, maybe politically convenient, but not Quranic. You can test that and see if you agree or disagree. Now, one question is, why are people like Shimr, how could they be unaware of imamat if they were with Imam Ali in Safin, if they were practicing, they used to pray, and certain examples of how much of a prayer, how much of a strong practice they had. All of the people who were in Karbala were parts of the prominent Muslims. And prominent Muslims at that time were generally known to be a part of the religious and political life of society. I can give another example from Iran. Did anybody find any of my examples from Iran offensive during the... All right, so I don't want to cause a problem. When I first went to Iran, right, one of the first things that always struck me is that whether you have a religious person, a moderately religious person, pro-revolution, anti-revolution, atheist, communist, anybody, right, any prominent person in Iran would always say, my grandfather was an Ayatollah. If you've ever experienced that, or if you're old enough to remember, there's a reason for that. Right? At one time, until the Qajar era, and even until the early Pahlavi era, education in Iran was not, there was no Danishgah-e Tehran, there was no Danishgah-e Sanati Shadid. If you learned, where did you go to learn? You went to a maktab, right? And then you went to a hawza. And as you were studying Sa'di and as you were studying arithmetic, you were also studying sarf and nahw and fiqh. Not because you necessarily wanted to become a mujtahid, but that course was the same course that a person would take to eventually become a judge, eventually become a civil servant, or an officer in the imperial court. Right? That was the curriculum. Does that mean everybody who went through that course was very religious? Well, generally it was associated with religion, and they knew a lot about religion because just like literature was part of the course, that was part of the course. So now, if we were to compare it to today, it's difficult for us to see how that would work, because we think of somebody who goes to Hawza as being religiously inclined. Maybe they're sincerely religious, maybe they want to benefit from certain reputation they would get. If I have a beard, then you'll think I'm religious, you'll trust me, maybe I'm sincere. Whatever, we have a certain opinion of what the Hawza is. But 100 years ago in Persia, is that what the Hawza was? No, the Hawza was how you got an education. If you wanted to be a doctor, right? Before medical medicine, it was Tibb Sunnati, right? Medicine was through that same curriculum. Astronomy, that same curriculum. You wanted to become the ambassador of Persia in Egypt, that was the curriculum. Right? Now, if somebody then says that, well, this person was a very pious person because they were good in their studies, does that mean much? No. So Shim and Shibith ibn Rabi'i and many of these other people who were evil in Karbala, they were leaders of society. The leaders of society got their position of leadership through being in charge of armies. Armies in the Muslim world that would go and fight, their leader would distribute the khums. He would have to know fiqh to distribute khums, right? He would have to pray with his people. I can't be the leader of the army, a religious society, and say that, well, why don't you lead the prayer? Then you'd become the person people would refer to, right? So, of course, that was the language of the time, right? So does that help understand that? Don't think that because Shim would come and ask fiqh questions that he was religious. Today, religious people care about fiqh and irreligious people don't care about fiqh. But it's more similar to how even today, our history of the Imams was not just a romantic child's history. Children's kind of have a hero and a villain. They were just as complex as people today, the societies today, politically, economically, in terms of personal motivations. And if we understand that complexity, then we'll derive better lessons for how to live in today's society. That doesn't mean, because it was complex, that therefore the Ma'sumin are not a perfect example. They are a perfect example, but their response was not just a response to everybody else's Yazid. There were people who were Yazid, and there were people who were strong believers, but not in the right principles. There were people who were strong believers, but weak in practice, and every other kind of complexity that we had in any human society. All right, the next question that we had. I think I lost the questions. How will Raj'at affect? So one is, well, how would Raj'at affect our life? Raj'at is the belief that people will return before the Day of Judgment. And there's two quick answers to that. Number one, not every belief is meant to have a direct effect on our life. Like, for example, the prohibition of interest. Right? The Quran takes a very strong position against interest. Now, honestly speaking, interest often is a good thing. Right? It gives me a kind of predictable profit. It can be very useful. But there's certain times in human life when interest can be very damaging. When there is a loss of a job, social upheaval, inflation, all of a sudden somebody can be destroyed because of compounded interest. Even though normally it might even help regulate economic relationships. Right? So sometimes in Islam we have certain principles that are not because they're supposed to affect us at all times, but they're important or they're taught because they develop a relevance in certain times. So Raj'ah, it might not have a direct effect all over in our life, but it might be something that will prepare us for certain types of tests or certain types of trials. And we have examples of that within Islam. right? When we look at certain parts of the life of the Ahlul Bayt, we talk about so many different things in the life of Ahlul Bayt. Many of those stories are not situations you and I are going to face. But how do I know? Which of us knows, God forbid, if we're going to have to suffer the loss of a young member of our family? I can't predict it. If I suffer a tragic loss, if a parent's child dies, right, there's nothing that that parent can do at that time to help them through that grieving process cleanly. Right? It's a very difficult test if somebody has to go through it. But if a person is familiar with the philosophy of life, the process of grieving, the examples of the Prophet losing his children, our Imams losing their children, it can give some preparation and some context that, God forbid, if I ever have to suffer that, then I can rely on that developed capital and I can get a benefit from it. Does that make sense? So when it comes to Raj'ah, what is the capital that it gives us? That's the question. It might come daily in my life, it might not come daily in my life, but it gives preparation. The capital that we get from Raj'ah is a reminder that certain sins and certain good deeds definitely will have a worldly reward. If I am told by you that, there's a lot of police in this neighborhood, you will definitely get caught if you speed, then I won't speed. If you tell me that there's police in the neighborhood, you have a 50% chance of getting caught, or you might get caught but you have to pay the fine in 20 years, then I might still not want to get caught, but I'll take it easier. Raj'ah tells us that the relationship between certain good deeds and reward, certain bad deeds and punishment, is so strong that Allah will reward or punish them in this life. And if you happen to die before you get that punishment, then Allah will bring you back to life, and this dunya you'll get the jaza before the hereafter. So it's like there's police roaming around everywhere in the neighborhood. There are rewards that are within this world. It reminds us that there is a very close connection between our actions and the result. So even if I'm at the end of my life and I realize that I might not be able to, for example, witness the appearance of the Imam, I still believe, or I have a reason to believe that I might be able to witness it because death is not a barrier. The connection between the reward for my sincerity and my goodness and the actions, the punishment for evil and the actions is close.
I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I'm not convinced by this because suppose that I'm a person who's doing lots of good deeds, but I'm not basically see all the consequences of the good deeds that I've done and die. So based on the description of the paradise and meeting God and being with God that is described in Quran, I think that any person would not like to come back and experience those gifts or rewards in this world. Because
no, there's a difference. So the philosophy.
Before you believe Rajat, you should believe on Ma'ad. Yeah, and that's more.
No, but there's a problem. This conversation that we're having is not a conversation where we are deciding for God, should you teach Rajat or not? Like if I'm teaching God that, I think this is a good idea, put Rajat as part of your Islamic teachings or don't put Rajat, then we can have this conversation. No.
Just define whether such thing is useful or not.
No, so there's two perspectives that we can have. One perspective is, I want to get the logic so that I can decide, is this to be part of my Islamic teachings or not? Right? Then we can say that once we have Ma'ad, why do we need Rajat? Ma'ad is enough. Right? If I'm making my religion, then I can say, you know what, I don't need this spare tire. I have the very good tire, it's not going to go flat. Ma'ad is a real solid teaching, I don't need a spare tire. But that's not our perspective. Our perspective is, God has given us a spare tire. Right? We have to see why He might have done so. So we're starting from the place that the Imams have taught Rajat. Our job is to try to see what might be the reason why they emphasized it. If we're not convinced that they emphasized it, then we can look at the authority and see, is it even an authentic teaching or not? That's a fair point. That I can argue or you can argue that I'm not convinced. These hadith are weak or they're made up. But if we're convinced they're made up, then you and I don't have the right to say that, well, why did they need to teach it? They had ma'ad. God knows what his purpose was, and if he wants to give, quote-unquote, spare tire or an additional reminder, then it's his religion, he can do so. Does that make sense? So we're not asking it to try to justify whether raj'at is true or not. We're asking it to try to understand what might be the reason why it was emphasized, assuming that it is authentic.
Yeah, but and these reasons doesn't make sense. There are some things like soul or roof, which God says to the Prophet that you don't know about it. Yeah, so these are, I think raj'at would be categorized as a soul as well. We really don't know about it. We just try to justify it by some.
No, and that's fine to justify it, because we're not. Our job when we're justifying it is to try to understand what might be the reasons. The fact is, for me, right, if I read Dua al-Ahd, it's a very different emotional and psychological effect it has on me than if I believe, oh, if I can be alive when the Imam comes, great. If not, then I'll meet him in Jannah. Logically, you're right. You have ma'ad. If you don't meet the Imam in this world, while you prayed for him, you said, Dua al-Faraj, and you didn't meet the Imam, you'll meet him in the hereafter. That's all good and true. But, if you're a Shia and you can just practice this in your life, read Dua al-Faraj for a week. Read, in Hala bayni wa baynahu al-mawtu alladhi ja'altahu ala ibadika khatman maqdiya. If death intervenes, then, oh Allah, break the barrier of death and bring me back. That psychological and that emotional effect is real. Right? There's no denying that it's real. The idea that death by itself is not a barrier between actions and reward, or actions and punishment. It is psychologically and emotionally a very powerful teaching that's brought out in ahadith, that's brought out in du'as. It does have an effect for how we appreciate that Karbala will end. It can have an emotional effect on people being ready to sacrifice or not being ready to sacrifice. Logically, could God have done it without rajat? Yeah, of course he could have. Right? That's above my pay grade. It's God's decision whether to teach it or not. But if it is taught, is there a psychological or a spiritual or a potential real world effect in terms of my connection? Right? That's certainly visible.
I think we can use the same logic to say even the resurrection day is not necessary. If you believe in God and God says something, you should do that. We don't need to have. Or you don't need to have a resurrection.
Yeah. You can just have the punishment of, why is there adab al-qabr? Why is there adab in qiyamah? Why is there sirat? Right? The bridge of sirat. Why is there
All the same, yeah? From the moment that your soul actually gets away from your body, after that.
Well, just like those are the same, raj'at is also part of that. A hadith tells us that raj'at is also the beginning of qiyamah. It's just a qiyamah beginning that comes from this world. Question?
Now I wanted to mention that raj'at is not something new. It's been mentioned in the Quran
numerous verses indicate.
We saw in other humans who have been brought back life for a lesson or something. So this raj'at is, I think, similar to that. God brings back the most highest and the most hated, and then for a lesson and for their punishment reward.
Sometimes psychologically, for a person who has been the victim of a great crime, to know that the criminal will be punished in this world, by itself, brings psychological closure. Right? And so these are effects that we can find for raj'at. If you're looking for a logical justification, that here, this is the proof, because of this, God has to teach raj'at, you're not going to find that. if you're going to find a conclusive proof that's going to convince you that this is, something that is certainly a part of Islam, it's going to be difficult to find. Just like every other teaching that we have within Islam, right? What we can do is we can say, is this a teaching of Islam or not? If it is, what insight or wisdom can we gain about it? If it's not, then it's not. So Raj'a is taught by Imams, and it's an old teaching that's referenced in the Quran and it's explicitly mentioned in a hadith. What are the effects? In my mind, the psychological effects are that it gives us a very close connection between action and consequence. Much closer and more intimate than is from this world and the hereafter. That's one example of Raj'a in previous ummahs. Yes. Yes. That's one example of being brought back to life. That doesn't prove Raj'a at the end of time, but it does prove that Raj'a is not something outside of the practice of God. He did it in the previous ummah, and there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't do it at the end of time.
Would you say also that this is part of the rahmat of God?
Yes. All of the different stages of reward and punishment are part of God's mercy. One of the stages of God's punishment and reward is Raj'a. The next stage is Adabul Qabr. The next stage is the adab and the reward on the Day of Judgment itself. Right? Some people will have hisab, some people will not have hisab. Then the next stage will be temporarily going to hell for those people who have not yet been purified of their sins. And then eternal reward and punishment. No, Raj'a is not for ordinary people. Raj'a is for those who have, ordinary people are still kind of potential. They have bil quwwa attributes. Raj'a is for those who have changed their potential into to actual good or evil. So I might still be kind of on the journey, and I haven't fully brought my soul to either a good or a bad result. Right? The Raj'a applies, just like adab of qabr, adab of the Day of Judgment, will apply to certain types of crimes. Not every evildoer is going to find out that they are going to hellfire in the grave. Some people will only find out on the Day of Judgment. So each of those stages has a certain wisdom. That wisdom is not always going to be fully understandable to our logic, but it has a certain logic and a complete principle. Sisters, we didn't get any chance to get your participation, so is there any questions or comments from the sisters, please?
Following that question,
Sure.
So does that consider to be only who has done the worst, or is that considered to be...
Yeah, those who've done the worst or those who've done the best.
So did that two...
The extremes. That's what the ahadith of Raj'at say. So, because it's the very good deeds that deserve a worldly reward, or the very evil deeds. Many people, they might get it right in this world. Right? So if I do a terribly evil deed, I will get punished in this world even before I die. But if for some historical reason or some divine wisdom, that reward is not able to come to me in this world, then it will happen in this world. It's also one last hujjah. So the whole purpose of qiyamah is a hujjat of God. Right? Otherwise, really there's no reason for qiyamah. We should just wake up and go to heaven or hell. Right? The whole reason for the stage of qiyamah that is mentioned very often in the Quran is to give a proof to people that, look, I gave you a chance. You can check your account. God's math is right. Right? You could have done right, you didn't. Right? So everybody will get a chance. Everybody will get an audit. Our organs and our limbs will speak. Right? So the whole point of that is to have a hujjah. So one part of giving that hujjah is, for example, if Yazid and Imam Hassan are back in this world, and that conclusion that wasn't achieved historically is achieved in this world. Just as qiyamah is unnecessary, right? But it's keeping that hujjah, or completing that hujjah. Raj'a is also helping to complete that hujjah. because we'll see with our own hands. This is why it was evil. This is why Imam Hussein was successful, because it was fine. One point, and then back to the sisters. Go ahead. Sure.
I was wondering, is there any certain criteria of a qualification a person has to meet to be experienced Raja? And if a person will know before she or he dies that he will be...
Some people might know before they die, but the criteria that's mentioned in Hadith is those who are firm in unbelief or firm in belief. That's the standard that we're given in a Hadith.
You mean by experiencing yaqeen? That would be a criteria, or it would be less than that?
The Hadith mention those who are so it's mahdul iman and mahdul kufr. Those who are pure in iman and pure in kufr, right? On the side of iman, it would be yaqeen. On the side of kufr, it would be juhud, which is obstinacy, and also doing good and doing evil. I think last question then on Raja.
Actually, I have heard some people say that, for example, Allah brings these bad guys like Shem and Yazid back for them to become better persons.
That is sometimes mentioned by Urafa in general, and even in Dua Kumail we have the phrase that لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاحديك وقضيت به من إخلاد معانديك لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما وما كانت لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. So there is in Irfani discourse, and sometimes even in some of these du'as, like this sentence in Dua Kumail, the expression that, why, oh God, do you have punishment? If it weren't for your own promise, then you would have let everybody go to heaven eventually, right? So this is an area that we don't have explicit Islamic teaching. What Islam has told us is that hell is for punishment. Might hell and the torture of hell be a means for cleansing and eventually bringing some people back to heaven? Maybe. And we do have some hadith that will be the case for mu'mineen who have sinned a lot. But will it be the case for any unbelievers? Right? That's above our pay grade. So Raj'ah might have that role, just like Qiyamah itself might have that role. But anytime you have a question like this, is Raj'ah rehabilitation or is it punishment? The same thing applies to Raj'ah that applies to Qiyamah itself. The same thing applies to Raj'ah that applies to the Akhirah. And the Akhirah, we don't know that.
Like the Hindus that we come to...
No. It's not a cyclical thing, that's for sure. That's not mentioned in any of these. But is there a rehabilitative element in it? Or is it entirely jaza and punishment? Well, Qiyamah is for punishment and reward, as the Quran says. But then there is still a possibility that for some people that there will be a rehabilitation or a kind of cleansing that God will give. In the end, God knows His wisdoms better. And if He decides to forgive some of the kuffar or some of the people in paradise, in hell, or even all of them, we don't have any objection to it. It's not our job. Allah, I only became a believer because I wanted this person to go to hell. That's not our role. So in Qiyamah and in Raj'ah we can't say. We do believe, and there's many hadith that tell us that unbelievers will not be treated equal to believers. Right? A person said that, well, what if people get forgiven for their sins? And Imam Ja'far Sadiq in one hadith explicitly says that Wallahi la yaf'alu dhalika bikum abada. Allah will never do that where Iman just becomes equal to unbelief. But if unbelievers are after a period of punishment and cleansing brought to it, we can't say. It's not our job to say. Last question that I have here is, how authentic are the maqatil generally, and specifically the maqtal which I recited on the night of Ashura? I'm not sure which part was in question, but there's some stories that are not mentioned by, that it's not clear how anybody would have been able to narrate. right? Because the people involved, for example, were martyred. So in general with maqtal, there's different perspectives. Some ulama say that you should try to stay historical and follow as close as possible to the most authentic historical narrations. That's one opinion, and it's a respected opinion. The opinion that I believe, and I follow myself, is that Karbala was not meant primarily as a historical event. It's historical events that were illustrating a divine purpose. So the events, the historical events, were meant by God and were brought about by God to illustrate certain values of religious significance. So God has a purpose in that legend remaining. Not because legend is not historical, but because God creates history in order to give us an example to be forever. Right? Why did Hajar and Ismail alayhim salam come to Makkah? Right? That whole story of Hajj, it's not fake, it's real. But it was engineered by God to become a legend. It actually happened, but it was engineered to create a place to start an ummah and a whole spirit of sacrifice, a religion, and a religious teaching that has a lot of meaning and depth. Karbala was engineered by God in the same way to create a legend. Now the question is, do I remember it at the level of the historical, or do I remember it at the level of the legend, meaning the values that are behind the history? Ahlul Bayt emphasized poetry, they emphasized performance, mourning publicly and out loud. And so, in my belief, the emphasis of Ahlul Bayt was to remember it at the level of the significance and the poetry, and not just the historical facts. That doesn't mean you make up facts. But what it does mean is that we do believe that God will keep alive certain parts of that story through the practice of people. So some of the stories that we have, for example, are visions by Allama Majlisi. Right. Now, a vision of Allama Majlisi is not useful for me or you to establish what is wajib or haram. It's not useful for me to establish what happened historically or not happened historically. If you or I are writing a history of Karbala, I can't say that, well, Allama Majlisi saw in a vision that Abbas a.s. had his 2 hands cut off, therefore it historically happened. You can't do that, because it's not a historical evidence. But is it an evidence in terms of the significance? If I believe Allama Majlisi was a pious means of conveying the significance of Karbala and the meaning of Karbala, then it's relevant. Not that I'm going to put in my history book that this happened, but that I can mention it on the minbar as part of the significance and the story of Karbala. It might even be true. It's just not known historically. It's known through that spiritual channel. And a big part of Karbala, this is by design, is that God created historical facts in order to have a certain performance exist within the Shia world. So, for example, is it just a historical coincidence that there is a shrine for Abu Fadl Abbas and a shrine for Imam Hussein? Many ulama have said that that's not a coincidence. God wanted ziyarah of Abbas a.s. to be done, and he wanted ziyarah of Imam Hussein to be done. The story of Karbala is perfected and complete by that means. Now, if you look at it with a historical lens, Imam Hussein is reported to have been buried here, Abu Fadl Abbas is reported to have been buried there. And maybe somebody can even bring a historical doubt that, well, was Abbas a.s. really buried here, or was it 50 meters in this direction? On a historical level, that's a valid question. But if we believe that God had a purpose for Karbala, He brought Abbas a.s., He brought Imam Hussein a.s., He directed, and our Imams, while they were alive, directed where the shrines were to be placed and how they were to be formed, so that when a person comes to Karbala, they are confronted with a certain scene. And God wanted certain stories to be remembered, and so He brought them within the visions or within the mind of our ulama and our community practice. Then we have a different perspective. Deviation comes when we say that therefore this is historical. No, we keep the history and we try to be accurate in understanding history. But we also remember that not everything in our life is about just what the facts were from history or archaeology. A lot of it is about meaning. And a mother connects to the story of Karbala differently than maybe a young man. An old person who's been to war connects to that story differently than somebody who is wealthy and never been to war. Right? That's fine. And if we believe that God has a purpose, then many of those incidents, which might not have been narrated directly by the person involved, might have been brought to life by the imams or by other means poetically. And we have many examples of that. Right? So those of you who are familiar, for example, there's poetry in Arabic, which the imams themselves said, it's composed by a non-ma'asum poet, that the imam said this was Ruh al-Qudus that inspired you, for Kumayt, for Dirbil al-Khuzai, and for other poets. And even for Persian poetry, or for Urdu poetry. Right? There might be Ruh al-Qudus, which is divine inspiration. It's just not hujjat for us. So our religion can't be deviated, and I say that, well, you know, Muhtasham Kashani is a very... we don't have it here, do we?
Oh, it's on the other side.
Is it? All right, so that poem is a very beautiful poem. It might be inspired by God. Now, if somebody says, therefore, I'm going to pray on the basis of the revelation of Muhtasham Kashani, that's not allowed. But if somebody says, I'm going to feel the events of Karbala through the lens of that poetry, then that's fine, even if you don't have a historical quote that where did Muhtasham Kashani get this scene from. It's not the point.
Some of the actually, what you mentioned, even from we got actually hadith that actually just pinpoint and mention exactly events of the.
Yeah, many of them were.
Many of them actually just are pretty much in line with actually with Maghata. And we have actually just dua for
Ziyarat al-Nahiya is also.
Yeah. That's as close as possible.
Yeah, if you actually look at it.